Okay, thank you very much for the award. My main research focuses on behavioral economics, which in a nutshell modifies classical models in economics by allowing for behavior that's more consistent with empirical and experimental evidence on decision making. And today, rather than give you highlights of the different things I've worked on, I wanted to give you a teeny glimpse of how behavioral economics may enhance our understanding of the labor market. So some of you have learned economics. The textbook models in economics offer three main views of how wages are set. There's the competitive equilibrium view, which asserts that wages are set by forces of supply and demand, so that if the demand for labor falls, wages should follow and drop as well. The bargaining theory view asserts that wages are the outcome of bargaining between the employer and the employee over the division of the surplus, so that if the short side of the market are the employers and they have all the bargaining power, they would extract all the surplus from the worker and essentially offer him his outside option. The third view, the contract theory view, asserts that work gives disutility to the worker, so that he will shirk on the job unless he's paid for every effort that he exerts. And so this implies that we should see in the labor market complete labor contracts, meaning contracts that monitor every little aspect of effort. However, these views have had difficulty explaining three important stylized facts in the labor market. The first is that nominal wages tend to exhibit downward rigidity. The second is that in times of recessions, firms are actually more likely to lay off workers than to cut wages. And third is that fluctuations in unemployment are more volatile than fluctuations in wages. Now, some of the great minds in economics, including Keynes, Solow, Akerlof, and Kahneman, have conjectured that the explanation of these facts has to do with the effect of pay cuts on morale. But this is so outside the view of conventional economics that it has never been rigorously modeled and incorporated into our models. So let me give you a very outline of how we may be able to do this and how we have done this. So I call this morale hazard. So the first point is that in contrast to the classical view, oftentimes the labor contract is incomplete, meaning there are many aspects of exerting effort on the job that are just difficult or impossible to measure or monitor. And so many times the employer will rely on the discretionary effort of the worker. And again, in contrast to the classical view, the worker is actually motivated to put effort into the job as long as he perceives his wage as being fair. Now, by fair wage, I mean here a reference point against which the worker compares his wage, where this reference can be shaped by things like his wage expectations, his wages in the previous periods, peer wages, and others. And this reference point may very well be above the current market wage. And so wage cuts that bring the worker's wage below the reference demotivate the worker and may lead to lower output. What are the effects of this morale hazard idea on the labor market in the presence of a business cycle? So to do this, let's look at a very simple toy example where I'll be making some very strong assumptions for simplicity. Okay, let's assume that the labor contract is as incomplete as it can be. It's just a flat wage. The second, let's assume that the reference wage is just the average of the wage expectations. And third, let's assume that if the wage of the worker drops below this reference, then he's so demotivated to work that he doesn't produce anything. Again, very extreme, but just for simplicity. And finally, let's assume that the firm finances the wages of the worker from the output that the worker produces. So let's look again at a very toy example. Suppose there's only two possible states. There's a boom and a recession. Each are equally likely. Here the numbers give you the monetary values of the outside option of the worker if he's not employed by the firm, and what is the output of the worker when he puts in effort. And let's assume that the firm has all the bargaining power, so that in the absence of morale hazard concerns, he would pay the worker essentially the lowest wage that the worker would be willing to accept, which is his outside option if he's not employed by the firm. So he would pay him 60 in a boom, 40 in a recession. And so that means that the average wage expectations of the worker is 50. That will form his reference wage. But then what we will see is that during a time of recession, the wage that the worker gets falls below his reference wage, which will demotivate him and cause him to produce nothing. Now, this will be very costly for the firm. And so what the firm would want to do is think, what is the lowest wage that he can offer the worker so the worker will still be willing to accept and will prevent him from being demotivated. This is paying him the outside option in the high state in every state, paying him 60 both in a boom and in a recession. Now, as you see, this will give the first effect, which is wage rigidity. The wage the worker gets is not responsive to the business cycle. To see the second effect, let's assume that during a time of recession, the output of the worker is even lower. Let's assume it's 50. Now what we get is that during a time of recession, the firm cannot afford to pay the worker his reference wage, so he can prevent him from being demotivated. And so the optimal thing for the firm to do in order to save on the cost is to lay off the worker, even though this is inefficient. And here we get the second effect, which is layoffs. And the two together give us the third effect, which is that we get more fluctuations in unemployment than in wages. Of course, this was a Mickey Mouse example, which was rather trivial. And so the challenge in the research is to generalize the little insights we got from the static example into a full-blown dynamic model and show mathematically that the equilibrium in this dynamic model, using tools from game theory, exhibit the same stylite facts that we've seen here. And finally, is to show that this framework, when it's properly and rigorously modeled, it can help illuminate various phenomena we see in the labor market, which are difficult to reconcile with standard classical models in economics. And some of them are the difference in rigidity between new and existing workers, secondary labor markets, the idea of overqualification, and part-time jobs. Thank you.